I don't think yet.
We never posted on Facebook on Instagram that we were going live.
I,
Yeah,
I
we
It's
posted, I
posted on
posted,
Instagram.
I posted on Instagram
Oh, we
saying,
are here. We are live, guys.
oh my gosh, we're live.
Oh my gosh, we're
That
famous.
was an hour. That was 6 hours of work that the general public will never see.
6 hours condensed into a 1 hour pre-show Zoom meeting.
None of you commented on my new glasses.
Oh, you have new
Oh,
glasses?
you have new glasses. Great. They look nice.
To be fair, it's Zoom, so it's hard to tell, I feel like.
Yeah.
Mhm. So, how's
Well,
everyone
we're here.
doing?
I am doing well. Let me put this back over here. Cool. So I'm trying to figure out how to view the live stream, but we can just get started with what our topic is
Right
for
here.
tonight.
Can we first? I know this is not. Um, I know this is not related to Guitar Squad, but Bob Saget just died.
Oh my God,
Oh,
Oh wow, that is what I said.
I predicted that Morgan would be the most upset.
I can't believe that. That's like insane. That's nuts.
Um, yeah, they said that
That must have just happened.
it says that the circumstances around his death are mysterious. You know what that means.
What? Are you
Rest in
making this
peace.
up?
No, I swear to God.
That's
I
awful.
wouldn't. That's what I read. I saw a couple different articles about it, so it's not like
When
the
did this happen?
joking. I don't know. 17 minutes ago, 13 minutes ago,
Oh my
8 minutes
God,
ago,
that's
oh
crazy.
He
no.
died,
65.
he died multiple times. That's why there's different timestamps on his death.
He's like
He
a
would have
cat.
liked that. He would have liked that.
There's multiple lives.
Multiple
Well, I was
lives.
thinking like he died and came back to life. Like, no, he's good. Then like, oh no, he's back.
Oh, I see. That's messed up. I can't believe
Well,
that.
it is messy. That's why everyone was like, oh, it's awful. But you're just like, oh, he lived multiple lives, which is a positive way to look at it.
I got ourselves. I'm into the live chat now. We are here. Jackie, I cut you off. Do you want to take us away with this one?
Well, we're here just to have a chat about music. And on off camera, after one of our streams, the four of us were talking, and we're talking about all the types of music we like and how a lot of stuff's underrated. And that got us to an interesting topic: is all music considered art? So we're just going to dive into a couple different scenarios. We would love to hear your thoughts on this topic. What do you listen to? What do you listen to? Do you think some music is better than others? Let's find out. So I think we all need to have something to compare uh, something to. It's a lot of times classical music is the highest standard in a lot of people's minds because we studied at conservatories. So I'd love to ask the squad, why is classical music held to such a high standard? Why would we study it in conservatories compared to other more popular genres that arguably have more of a reach nowadays?
I feel like that's a good question. 'Cause I feel like, I mean, I personally do this a lot. I feel like with a lot of things, when anybody criticizes classical guitar, like my biggest defense always is like, oh, well, not many people like it anyway. And kind of a lot of things like that. And the question that honestly I'm surprised no one asked is like, well, why did you study it? Um, I think for me personally, the answer is just that I like it, and I feel like that's kind of. I mean, it's not the best answer, honestly, but I think it's just kind of just do and hope if you can within reason, obviously do what you like. So I like this thing. I want to learn more about it, and I think the conservatory path is definitely the best way to do that. Only because you have everything all in one place. In terms of having a fruitful and fulfilling career, in terms of whatever you consider successful, maybe not the best option.
To what Jackie was saying, I feel like um guitar, like music in general, is in a weird space. So we're talking specifically of classical music. But I do think music in general is in a weird space, where a lot of people don't go to school for it, mainly because it's both like a study and a hobby. So a lot of people with their hobbies usually don't go to school for it. Like Ben does jujitsu, BJJ, right? and people aren't like going to school for that. A lot of people I know actually love like cooking, and you can go to school for it, but not as many people do. Like a lot of chefs don't go to school. So I feel like it has this weird space of being a hobby. So that makes it so that a lot of musicians in the world are just self-taught. I don't personally think classical music should be held to a higher standard. I just think it happens to be um, the music that is taught in school. And honestly, I will admit that classical music is pretty deep compared to like a lot of popular music I listen to. There's a lot more going on harmonically, like melodically, even like form wise. It's pretty deep. So I can understand why there are so many classes devoted to it. It's also very old and well documented. Like I'm thinking about popular music. If we go back a long time ago, it would go into like folk music, and you can't really have a great music history class on folk music in the same way because there's not as much documentation on it, right? So I feel like classical music is like set up to be a good school subject, given its extensive history in like the West, and given its depth in some pieces. So I understand why a lot of people don't go to school for music, and I also understand why classical music is often the focus. So yeah, those are my
But
thoughts.
but to answer Jackie's question of why do you think it's in the schools? Why do you think that genre is there? I think you basically said it's well documented. And to add to that, a lot of times it's where the money came from. So if you think about the reason that Bach had so much music, he's such an easy one to pick on, is because he had a job that was like, yeah, we're just going to pay you to write music for this church for like the rest of your life, and we're going to pay you really well, and like you can live here and have like 50 kids. And so if that happens for a couple hundred years, and people want to then keep copying the people that they were inspired by, right? Like who is the dude? Sciano, was that him at heart? And he was just like, he's like, everybody just wanted to be Bach. Beethoven wanted to be Bach. Schoenberg wanted to be Bach. He's like, they're all just trying to tell their truth like Bach did, but in a different language. So I think that that's the reason why, probably because sometime around then they started teaching music in schools, right? This wasn't, I think it was after Beethoven that they were like, oh, we can actually teach this as a subject, and follow the money trail, right? That's why it makes sense, right? And also the time thing, jazz and pop music are so new, right? Like
Yeah.
popular music as we know it today is so much different than when my dad was a kid. We would call that rock or classic rock, right? And then so I think it's a little more as ever changing as the classical music world is. I think it's a little more static than some of the other genres. So I think it's why it's there. It's because it brings in the money.
And to add just really quick, I mean, you do see a lot of schools adding program. Even Hart just added like the commercial music program. Berkeley has like more modern music programs. So a lot of these schools do or are starting to. I mean, pretty much every music school has a jazz program now. And if you go back like 50 years, that probably wasn't the case. So they're adding these programs in.
I guess one thought I quickly had on that too, though, is what counts as like documentation? Because I'm sure there's way more YouTube videos on like the Beatles than there are videos on like Bach. I'm not saying that overall in terms of where it is, but I'm just saying like on one platform there might be more documentation, quote unquote, of that thing than that. So that's one thought I had. And then the other thing I was thinking of too, actually, is a video I saw actually with Rick Beato talking about like this might maybe is a side topic, but I just want to definitely share because it is kind of relevant. Is rock music going to become the new jazz music? And his main point of that is like you said, Morgan, like 50 years ago, jazz music was not taught in schools, and I know a big issue with like jazz academia is that like is that's becoming more of an academia, and that's not what it was originally. It was something you were self-taught. Is that you like learn the streets, you learn the people talking, and then now it's like, oh well, now if you want to be a jazz musician, you have to go to school for it. But none of those guys that were the big guys they looked up to, whether it was Miles Davis, John Coltrane, none of those guys formally went to school for not in this, at least not in the same way that we go to school for it nowadays. And their thinking is that maybe 20, 30, 50 years from now classic rock is going to become that new thing because now it's people that grew up playing it playing it like just learning by ear, learning it, and now teaching people in a more academic way. And jazz is going to become the new classical, and classical is going to kind of be not as relevant anymore. I'm not saying that's the case, but I am curious what you think about that, because that I agree some of that could happen because kids want to learn classic rock, but it's like an older thing. Same way people want to learn jazz because it's the older, more advanced thing than just playing punk rock music, for example, which is a little bit more obviously a little bit newer than jazz is.
I think all those are really interesting points. And I think that is a great segue into how genres are judged and are they all created equally? Does it have to have a certain longevity in order for them to be credible or to be studied? Kind of reminds me of how museums choose contemporary art that's being created today compared to some of their masterworks, right? Who is exactly making that selection, and perhaps the experts and are they the ones to really judge what is high art or what is something that is really worth listening to that might attest to time, like a Beethoven or a Mozart, something of that quality. But I just want to kind of also say that a lot of genres have a certain level of complexity. Morgan talked about the harmonic structure. I think that's something that drew me to classical music or classic rock, is just a little bit more advanced harmonies than just like 2 or 3 basic chord patterns. You maybe have 6 or 7 in different keys and a lot of intrigue for the ears. So that's what I was being drawn to just as a musician and as a person. So, and I think you can get that from a lot of genres. So would love to hear your thoughts on that,
Well, I was
guys.
gonna
Are they held to the same standards?
Well, I was gonna go actually, Jackie. On what you're saying, I was gonna add into that. I think like some classical music is quote unquote very simple and boring, just like a basic 1 4 5. I know we make fun of a lot of like Sora and Giuliani stuff because it kind of is.
Diabelli.
Yeah, exactly. And the thing is though, like it was like if you really took some, I mean, like obviously yes, it's not all of them, but if you took some of the Beatles songs, some of them harmonically are pretty interesting, and some of the way they modulate, some of the ways they use different instruments, some of the ways they use different ways to set up different chord changes or the way that they're voicing the chords in terms of how they're spreading them out is super interesting to analyze. So you could almost analyze, and you could argue that some Beatles songs are more harmonically interesting than some classical music, and the same thing goes for I think for pop music as well. Morgan, I don't know if you saw it. There's one video where Adam Neely is like analyzing the flute line in "Single Ladies," the Beyonce song, and he's talking about how like that line is like some like weird scale, but why it sounds so good is because you hear like the fifth of the scale, which normally isn't played that way. So you could argue that some pop music is also more interesting harmonically than some classical music. And obviously it's not like a one size fits all kind of thing. But I guess the question then also is like, I mean, maybe a bigger question is what is then classical music? You know what I mean? Like some Andrew York stuff is, I'm sure, just 1 4 5 as well. Is that still? But that was written maybe let's say I don't know 5 to 10 years ago. Is that classical music then? If it's harmonically simple and it was written pretty recently for an instrument that could potentially play it on steel string guitar, and it would sound probably just as good, which isn't generally, and steel string guitar generally isn't seen as a classical instrument. I'm not saying it is or it isn't, but it's not seen that way. So it raises
Yeah.
up some questions, you know.
And your point, your question of is Andrew York, I mean, that's a very specific example, right? But a question like that is a hop, skip it, and jump away from, okay, is Andrew York classical music? Oh yeah, because he composes music in the Western tradition. Okay, cool.
What is the
Is
Western
it
then?
is the Western tradition of Baroque, classical, romantic, and modern composed music?
But what would be that tradition? Because I know a lot of his stuff he kind of just some, not all of it, but some of his stuff he would just sit down and kind of improvise it and kind of be like, oh, that sounds cool. I'll do that, I guess. And then, oh, what was that idea I had yesterday? I recorded it on my phone, which sounds pretty similar to how bands jam and make rock songs. Sorry,
Right,
make
right,
rock
right.
songs.
Well, what I was going to say is that if you take um, a, a sample of a classical piece and then put it into an instrumental, like a hip hop instrumental, is that classical music, right? Like I don't know, For Elise is in a Nas song, right? Like is that classical music, right? So I'm not really saying anything controversial. I think I'm just agreeing with you that the boundaries can get really blurry. But Jackie's question reminded me of something I heard once in a class in my undergrad, and it really got my blood pressure up quite a bit. And there's a teacher that said there's two things. There's two different kinds of music. There's art and then there's entertainment. And that made me very upset because who's to say And you could say, I'm sure there's lots of people say, well, it's just better made. It's right, like the analogy of um, like you could have really good spaghetti, right, with very simple ingredients, but all the ingredients are really high quality. That's art. But Olive Garden, that's entertainment. But I don't agree with that, because you have some people that grew up eating Olive Garden, right? And I don't particularly like it. I want a tomato sauce that's more developed and a pasta that's better, that's cooked better to my liking. But that doesn't mean that that can't be art for one person. So I have a really hard time. Am I making any sense at all?
I think you're no, Ben. I think you're. I guess my main stance is I'm not necessarily trying to even say something. I'm just more so posing questions like, well, what about this kind of thing? Um, and Ben, on your note of food, I do agree. I think that definitely has something to do with it. I think the other thing, I mean, everyone hates me for saying this. Like, I personally think all wine tastes like box wine. I'm probably gonna get hated in the chat for saying that. But because my first experience with wine ever was box wine, and I was like, oh, this tastes kind of bad, but I'll get drunk off of it, so whatever, it's fine. And I've had like wine people like, oh, this is like a $50 bottle of wine, it's really good. Oh, this is like a $40 bottle of wine, it's really good. You gotta try it. To me, it just all tastes the same. I cannot appreciate one wine from the other. It just tastes like wine to me. I can tell maybe where one was like, oh, this is a bit sweet or this is a bit not sweet. But I wouldn't, if somebody said one or the other, I don't know if I could tell you why one is better or worse than the other. But that also comes from, I could say, a slightly uneducated standpoint on wine. And I think that goes for a lot of things as well, because there are some things that I have had like quote unquote good. I'm not gonna get into those because I don't want to start any controversies over food. But I've had that are good, and when I have those things that I think are not as good, and I talk to people who only have had those things, um, they can't tell the difference between the good ones and the not so good ones. I can be like, well, how can you not taste like yours doesn't have this, and what I'm talking about when they make it, it tastes like this. Like they're like, I don't know, it just all tastes the same to me. So I think some of that comes into our music taste as well in terms of what we grew up with, what we know, and what we connect to. Just kind of to add in. Jackie also mentioned that Ben Diamond had a question in the chat. We can get to that in a
Oh
second.
yeah, I was just going to do a quick shout out to the people in the chat, but let's.
That is a perfect segue then. So, yes, thank you everyone in the chat for being here, throwing in some comments, throwing some thoughts. Also here. So Ben's Diamond's comment was he wants to know our thoughts on electric guitar being used in music conservatories and in classical music. So I've been saying a lot of stuff. So why don't one of you guys weigh in some thoughts on that?
I just want to add one thing to the previous conversation, and it was that, and I'll answer the question too. I feel like a lot of the argument for like classical music, I mean, a lot of it is semantics, right? When you're talking about Andrew York and whether or not he's a classical, like, are his pieces classical music? I mean, you're just arguing semantics there. I feel like it doesn't really matter what his pieces are. It's the same way, like, you can do it with non-classical genres, like Andrew Jackson Jihad, I don't know if you guys know them, is a folk punk band. Like, it's a fusion of two different bands. I mean, fusion, the style of fusion is combining genres. So that to me is almost kind of irrelevant, like what Andrew York's music is, because it's just good music to me personally. And it doesn't matter what the genre is. But to Ben's question, I feel like electric guitar, it's interesting because I feel like the electric guitar can do a lot, especially with all of the effects you can put on it and the common usage of effects. Like, you could put them on a classical guitar, but like effects are very common for electric guitars. But I do feel like it's also kind of underutilized. In a purely classical space. This might get back into the semantics argument, but where it's not utilized, or where it's not underutilized, I'm sorry, is in like the soundtrack space, which is a lot of classical composers writing for movies or writing for media. And there, I think it's actually used a lot. And speaking to like my theater vibes, like, it's used there all the time by people who are classically trained musicians writing composition, right? So I feel like it's used more than I think it's given credit for in a classical space, but I do think purely in a concert hall with no other media surrounding it, it's like grossly underutilized for what it can do.
Absolutely agree. I think that a lot of the new music that I'm seeing by like really interesting composers coming out, a lot of it is for electric guitar. I remember looking into like Bang on a Can All Stars, and that's like a really cool contemporary group of musicians, and they have electric guitar. They promote that, and I can see people like who are classically trained but have dabbled in electric guitar, like Gigi, for instance, is going and playing with them now. So I think that, to Morgan's point, if they do incorporate more electric guitar into the curriculum, I think that would only benefit guitarists in the conservatory world. I know my and my colleagues training at Hart had like a little jazz electric guitar class, but it was in the middle of junior senior year. No one really took it like as seriously because you're thinking about all these crazy complex harmonies and not actually getting into the technique and a lot of the advantages of electric guitar. And outside of school, I mean, we listen to electric guitar, get asked to play a lot of electric guitar, and to do that well is very difficult. So my opinion is yes, it should be introduced more. And the cool thing is, I think not only would it help with evolving classical and electric guitar further, but I mean, I went to a Yale chamber concert a few years back, and a lot of the stuff was on electric, and it was super cool. So I think some schools are doing it, but maybe not nearly enough. I would like to hear your thoughts on that.
Yeah, one thing, and I don't know if John, like I know Ben, you used to play a bunch of like metal stuff. Like I've seen your old Facebook videos and you're like shredding, like you can shred. Um, but I know John, you in particular, like do a lot of blues, and we've talked a lot about blues and we've like jammed on blues. I feel like one thing in particular for blues playing that's hard to teach, I guess, is like it almost sounds kind of like rough, like it's kind of unclean or kind of like dirty sounding. And I can't put it to words, but you can hear when somebody's like playing it classically. Like if a classical player plays blues and they don't know how to play blues, everything is almost like too accurate. I don't know if you get what I'm saying, but like there's a roughness to blues that I don't know how you would teach that in a classroom.
There's a certain conversational aspect to blues that you kind of lose when you're just thinking about um, I'm going to execute a note with as much clarity as possible. Like that's not what blues players are thinking about, right? They're thinking about line and
Mhm.
maybe being creative and maybe showing off, right?
You can say the same thing about classical players, though. But I mean, I think with blues, like the cultural context and the history behind it, and like the reasons why you create it for that specific expression. I mean, it's specific to genre, but it does kind of reach all genres, does it not?
Yeah, absolutely.
I
So, yeah, please, John.
Oh, sorry. I was just gonna say the other thing too. I think with blues, and kind of Morgan to go off what you were saying, is that I think, and this goes for other genres as well, is I think a lot of people that play classical that are trying to learn blues, they just don't know what blues music sounds like because they're trying to learn it, as opposed to learning it to play it. If that makes any sense. Um, and like I'm thinking about like, and I think Morgan, maybe because I think you learned more about blues later on after you knew how to play classical, and for me, blues was the first thing I learned. So for me, like part of my struggling to learn how to play guitar was struggling to learn how to play blues, and you already knew how to play guitar, and you were then trying to figure out how to play blues, and so it becomes two different like sides to the same kind of thing too. I mean, it's like two different paths to the same thing, and I think that also happens in classical music. I know, and I'm sure you guys can all agree. I don't want to name the recording I'm thinking of, but there was like that one hit recording in the history of tango with two great players, and you can tell it feels a little like forced, kind of stiff, and not really the same thing that you feel. And then you listen to another recording in the history of tango with two other players who both have a big background in Latin American and in Latin American style music, and theirs just feels so much more natural and full. And funny enough, the two players that are that felt stiff are actually, you could say, are technically better and more world-renowned musicians than the other two, arguably so. But yet one of them is better better for the style. You know what I mean? So I think it comes in classical music as well.
I was
Yeah,
just
and I
looking for there's a video on YouTube. I couldn't find it, but it's this like 5-part John Mayer blues lesson. And I'm not saying he's like the be all end all when it comes to blues guitar. But it was really cool the way he was like singing and playing, and like he that the original question of like where Ben Diamond was saying, do you see guitar, where's the guitar's place in classical music in the conservatory? I think that guitarists, electric guitarists, really need a lot of help deciding how to learn how to play the instrument, because you have people that put in the same amount of time and get like really crazy awesome shredding results, and then some people that just can't seem to get it because there's no like defined method on how to do it. That wasn't the question though. But John Mayer in that one video really shows like, oh, this is how I approach this. And I think that's kind of the biggest difference between electric guitarists, like some ones that are really good and ones that are not so good, is like a framework for understanding it, because in general I don't think the electric guitar community has that so much.
Yeah. And one thing to add is that I kind of take back. I feel like you can teach blues. You just need to teach it kind of in the same way you would teach like a jazz kind of thing, where it's a lot of listening. But I will say that like I feel like every genre of guitar playing has like a certain dialect, I guess, that you can only learn through being exposed to it by listening to other people play it. So John's point was that like when I didn't first learn blues, right, and I learned it later, I didn't know like the dialect or the language of I guess dialect is better because it's all guitar, right? But I didn't know like that dialect, and the only way for me to like properly, if I try to play like technically what the notes are in blues, I can play it. It just sounds like I'm speaking a foreign language, though. It sounds like stiff and it sounds not right. And I feel like that only comes through listening and like very closely listening to people who are very fluent in that language and copying that. So I kind of take it back. I do feel like you could teach something like blues in a conservatory. It would just be very listening focused.
Yeah, that's all really interesting, guys. And just to go off, I remember the first time I learned the blues, it was literally like, here's a scale, play the notes in this scale, and then here's the backtrack and improv. And I was just basically like, again, no context, no background information. So of course I couldn't produce it. We like equations as classical, like everything's almost laid out at first, and then you try to interpret what's on the page, but there's a lot that you have to bring and discover. So that's like a different part of that music genre and that creation, which is super interesting. It really does unlock like a totally new set of skills. And just to kind of go back into another point that Ben Diamond had is he's said yes and no about rock becoming the new jazz, because there's new rock that borrows from pop. And I think that's kind of interesting that the longer that a genre is around in the ether, like hundreds of years, 50 years, how long, how it evolves and changes. It's really hard like to lump everything into classical when you're thinking about hundreds of years of changes. We have the different subsections. So is that going to happen more with rock and jazz and pop? And should we have certain genres that should be taken more seriously as they evolve? For instance, rap is very young, but you can argue is just as complex as classical music when it comes to the different rhythm structures and then the lyric structures as well, the meaning behind it, the cultural context. So love to hear what you guys think about that too.
Can I ask one quick question? It's kind of a tangent. It's just a question for Ben. I'm really curious. My image, since you were very into like metal and especially like prog metal, my image is that the playing is similar to classical in that you're playing very cleanly, like everything is super clean and technical, right? Is that true? That was my one aside question, and we can go back to the conversation.
I mean, yeah, that's it depends. Again, it's a semantics thing, right? If you look at bands like Dream Theater or bands like, I don't know, Yes, or like just general, like who is seen as like the people that play progressive music, they play really clean, right? but then like Mars Volta is like experimental progressive, and they're not clean at all, except for their drummer.
Okay.
And so like, and so how do you, you know, and so there's a lot in there about that.
Yeah.
But I'm gonna take I know you were gonna answer the question. I'm gonna jump right in front of you, Morgan. And I'm gonna use your words against
No,
you.
I
I don't
wasn't
know.
gonna.
I don't know what you're gonna say. You said
I was.
more.
I was
You
gonna ask
said
you a question.
no. You said it's just semantics whether or not Andrew York is technically classical or technically this or technically that. And so I'm going to say it's just semantics whether or not you call something art, because there are, again, well, now that we're talking about rap, I think rap is awesome. I think rap is, and I think we have to be really careful how we judge rap on a live streaming platform, right? Because like none of us are rappers and none of us come from that culture, except for Morgan, maybe, of like, of just like, you know, of coming from a culture where some of those big names have come from. But I think that that is a beautiful representation. That is a great way how Black music in America, or music created by Black artists, has snuck its way into the limelight by following the money trail. So what I mean by that is, if you look at the history of hip hop, if you look at the history of Motown, if you look at the history of blues, it's all kind of the same. You have a bunch of Black musicians who are making music, and the mainstream doesn't really like them, and go, no, we don't want none of that. And then those musicians keep making music, and then eventually, once they start to get big, the rest of America or the rest of the world goes, oh, wait a second, what are you doing over there, right? The Beatles were like, oh, Chuck Berry, that's really cool. It was Chuck Berry, right, who had the Crickets? And then the Beatles were like, we're going to make the Beatles. Or it was Elvis who, you know, like whatever country western singers that were Black, or blues players, or rap. So I think it's a wonderful tactic that's unfortunate because it highlights the evil stamp of racism that's in this country. But that being said, I think it's a wonderful way to be able to develop a genre that is now sort of like developing, that on the cusp of whatever the genre of rap is, and then also popular music, right? So case in point, using samples. Digital sampling is something that we saw in a lot of 90s electronic and 90s hip hop music. And now that is something that pop musicians now do. Like Shawn Mendes does it. Shawn Mendes is not hip hop, right? So that's the point that I wanted to illustrate. So everything is art.
I wanted to add, so you're like highlighting the trend of like in America, at least, like Black musicians creating a new style of music, and it kind of like being taken later. It seems like it's interesting. It seems appropriative, right? Of like us to like take jazz and later be like, oh, hey, that's really cool. We hated it at first, but let's do that now. You know what I mean? It seems very appropriative. I It's like nice. I don't know. It's mixed, right? Because it's nice that now it's like recognized and in schools and like a very popular thing. Like we're highlighting this very cool thing that has been created in America by Black musicians, but at the same time, it does feel like icky and appropriative. I don't know. It's interesting. I don't know. So it's just my thoughts.
Well, I think it's kind of interesting that throughout the conversation, there's definitely, cultural influence when it comes to different classes and politics, like plays such a role in music history and music creation, it seems like. So a lot of the stuff that we talk about, it's like we're creating art for the sake of art, but it's interesting when we're actually looking back at the history of a lot of this art creation, how heavily influenced the rest of the world has on it, when it comes to like what we study, how we judge it, do we pay more attention to it if, again, someone has the money to go produce a really high quality record and it winds up on the top 40 versus, maybe something that has more soul that isn't as well widespread. how do we judge that again over time? It's interesting.
I have like a small little story. I remember we actually had a really cool. Oh, I'm sorry. There's a barking dog. But we had a really cool ethnomusicology teacher in our undergrad. And if you don't know uh, ethnomusicology, it's the study of like cultures through music. I remember reading this one article, and it was on, I believe it was on salsa music, like a Japanese salsa band making salsa music. And the study by this ethnomusicologist was basically all about how this Japanese like salsa band was creating more authentic salsa music than most popular salsa music in Latin America, because they literally, it was like the equivalent of like uh the early musicians where they're using like actual old instruments and playing it actually the way they did back then, where these musicians in Japan were like, we're going to play it as authentically salsa as we can. And it was really cool because it was talking about how that's like a very Japanese, like from his studies and his like research on it, a very Japanese thing to do is to like try to be as authentic as possible with it, even if you're not from that area. I thought it was kind of related. I just thought it was a really interesting article that I read.
That's really cool. Could you go ahead and pull that up for us, Jamie?
Me? Oh, I don't know where it is. It was a
Jamie,
long
pull that
time.
up.
I will try to find it at some point.
So one thing I was thinking about, and I was thinking about it for a little bit while we were talking, and I think Morgan's point definitely brings it back up, is that I feel like anybody who tries to do as someone else did is always going to be behind in a way, and I feel like that's like a perfect example of it. Especially because like salsa music is still like evolving. Like so many countries in South America have their own version of salsa. Personally, I can't do this, but like I know Kiara can. Like she like you'll play salsa. She's like, oh, that's salsa from like Colombia. Oh, that's salsa from Peru. Or that's salsa from Cuba, and she can tell the difference between different styles because their music is always evolving. I think that's the other thing with like rock and pop and hip hop and rap is that they're always evolving. And I guess maybe a good closing point, but it kind of leaves a lot more questions. Is in a way I feel like yes it is, and obviously Ben Diamond's going to be happy about this, but in a way I feel like classical music and classical musicians aren't evolving as well as other musicians are. And that's kind of where I might leave that. If we want to add feedback into there, we can, or we can save that for another stream down the line, possibly. But yeah.
I think that's a good place to end. And I also want to point out that in my interview on the Lone Guitarist podcast with Patrick Kearney, who came to the University of Hartford and gave Jackie Jones a masterclass, just Jackie Jones, nobody else.
He went there just for her too, right?
Yeah.
That's borderline not well, but okay.
Right. No. He points out at the very beginning of the show that metal and classical music are very similar in that they're introspective, that they're always trying to improve from their own standpoint. How can we do our job better? How can we be cleaner? How can we be faster? How can we be more expressive? Where those two genres have similarities. I would agree with you, John, completely, that classical musicians in some ways resist change a lot harder as an institution than a lot of other genres of music. And I would like to say that everything is art or nothing is art. That's how I look at it. It's a made up word. If you're moved, then it's art.
Well, I would say that's a good note to end on. Thank you, everyone, for tuning in. Stay tuned for more live streams every Sunday at 8. And we're going to have some guests coming on, some other guitarists that we really like. So stay tuned for that, too. If you have any ideas for topics, feel free to message us. And then other than that, I hope you guys have a great week. Thanks for tuning in. Bye.